Albatross Island, an isolated rocky outcrop in the western approaches of Bass Strait. Home of the shy albatross, the island is something of a mecca for sea canoeists. "30 kilometres off the Tasmanian coast, lying between King and Hunter Islands, it is exposed to winds from every quarter. Southwest storms roaring up from Antarctica, easterly gales sweeping in across Bass Strait. Albatross is one of a score of islands in northwest Tasmania, many of them uninhabited except during the muttonbird season. Members of the Maatsuyker Canoe Club have visited Albatross Island 3 times, in 1988, 1993 and 1996. Trips in this area can be a challenging experience. Changeable weather conditions nearly always bring strong winds and rough seas. Three-metre high tides, combined with extensive shoals and treacherous reefs, produce strong 5 to 6 knot currents that change rapidly and are out of step with high and low water. All combine to test skills and local knowledge of sea canoeists and fishermen alike. Western Bass Strait is a notorious graveyard of boats. This video is a record of the Maatsuyker Canoe Club's 1993 and 1996 trips to Albatross Island. Careful planning and preparation are required for trips of this type, particularly since the club's philosophy is not to carry emergency gear such as EPIRBs and flares. We packed enough food and gear for 2 weeks, as our stay on the island could easily be extended because of bad weather. Our kayaks are equipped with electric bilge pumps, sails and rudders, the latter essential in the expected windy conditions. To the detailed maps of the area, we added information on tides, currents and campsites. Both the 93 and 96 trips started from Denium Point in early January. We planned to leave 1.5 hours before high water, giving us favourable currents to Stack Island. Laurie Ford was my companion in 96. And Mick Verrier in 93. Favourable winds would mean an easy sail on the first leg to Hunter Island. Hunter Island was 20 kilometres away. For the first 10 kilometres it was very shallow. Even at high water you can become grounded. The tide funnels in between the islands, causing strong currents impossible to paddle against. We were lucky that the wind was counteracting this to some extent. For most of the time we could lie back and enjoy the freshening winds. As we neared Stack Island, hard paddling was needed to avoid being swept out into the Southern Ocean by a strongly flooding tide. We pulled into Stack Island for a quick breather and a few photos of Cape Barren geese. Then we crossed over to the southern end of Hunter Island and the mutton birders' hut, where we planned to stay the first night. It was annoying to see that someone had broken a window to gain access since our last visit. Laurie cleaned up the mess, including a few million ants. From the hut you could see the tidal currents working in Hunter's Passage. To the southwest lay the two Doughboys and Trefoil Island, while further west was Steep Island and Nares Rocks. Later on, the usual west coast sunset was followed by a rising full moon. After a brief walk along the beach at Renard Point, it was back to the hut to enjoy the last taste of civilised accommodation for a while. In '93, the next day began with a glorious sunrise heralding a perfect day for crossing to Albatross Island. Not that Mick saw it, he enjoyed the luxury of a sleep-in. Morning chores over, we had a leisurely start to our trip up the western side of Hunter Island, in the best conditions either of us had ever seen in this area. Virtually no swell and even less wind. We had timed our start so that we should have the currents in our favour. It was nearly 30 kilometres to Albatross Island. We passed Steep Island out to our west and headed north up the coast. Two hours later, Mick and I passed Wallaby Point. Initially we had thought there was no swell, but this made us wonder what landing on rocky Albatross Island would be like, 15 kilometres further out to sea. In '96, the weather was less than kind, but still good for paddling. Laurie and I rounded Webber Point. To the south lay the Doughboys and Trefoil Island, which we had initially planned to visit on this trip, but since we would be going there in March for our AGM, we gave them a miss. We followed the shoreline of Hunter Island for about 2 kilometres before deciding to head out to Steep Island for a look. Neither of us had been out there before. It is only about 5 kilometres off the coast, but is usually too rough to visit, being in an exposed position, and it doesn't look particularly interesting from a distance. The eastern side of the island is covered with muttonbird rookeries. We noticed some birders' huts above the pebbly beach and decided to land and reconnoitre.
Oh yes, there is a few more.
Bloody wonderful! Just bloody knocking sugar up. No, I never saw it. Went into the door and shook.
Although the swallows had made a mess, the huts were in far better condition than those we had seen on other islands. The thong was quite an ingenious way of keeping the door closed. I climbed the narrow track that led to the top of the island, while Laurie headed back to the kayaks. Carefully negotiating the ankle-breaking muttonbird burrows, I was completely unprepared for what was over the top. It was as if a huge bite had been taken out of the western side of the island. Maybe the island was volcanic and the central section had been blasted away in some huge explosion. Leaving the cave behind us, we pushed out through the choppy seas on the southwest corner of the island. Crossing back to Hunter Island, we headed north again, hugging the shore. An unusual pink rock attracted our attention, and on closer inspection turned out to be a dead whale. Judging by the body shape, it was a humpback whale, quite common in these waters. Now we were rounding Wallaby Point, where we stopped briefly for lunch. Then it was off on a long slog to Albatross Island, a line of whitecaps to our west indicating a strong current flowing against us. 3 hours later we were welcomed by the shy albatross. The last 3 kilometres was a tough paddle against a strong current and choppy sea. We had missed the tide because of our stay on Steep Island. How different from the '93 trip, when Mick and I cruised up to the rocky cliffs in perfect conditions. There appeared to be no current at all as we paddled along the rocky flanks of the island, heading for a small gully on the northeastern end, the only feasible place to land. Celebrate the safe landing.
I'll get the first swing, all right?
Yep.
Here's the Albatross.
It's probably warm. After hauling our boats up to a safe level, we climbed the gully that runs through the island. This led to a series of caves. The first one opened out to another gully that virtually cuts the island in two from east to west. From here you could see Hunter and Three Hummock Islands. Surrounded by the coarse conglomerate crags, we climbed to reach a second, larger cave formed when sea levels were much higher. This cave was used in the 1870s by hunters who captured and killed the albatross, boiling them down for oil and their feathers. The floor of this cave was strewn with heaps of albatross bones. Further on, a rocky amphitheatre formed a natural death trap for the birds. Albatross landing in here could not escape because of the lack of air currents, and it was too steep for them to climb out. Laurie did his good deed for the day and rescued 2 complaining birds from certain death.
Fight me and there'll be trouble. Golly, they will. I'll throw you back over the bloody side again. Nasty little bloody brute.
Take off your jacket.
So the world is round with all you
the highest parts of the island were covered with over 1,000 nesting pairs of birds. Shy albatross are magnificent creatures with a wingspan of over 2 metres and aristocratic features. It was possible to get very close to adult birds. They didn't seem to mind humans at all. The chicks, however, had a tendency to vomit the contents of their stomachs over your shoes if you got too close. Generally, the colony seemed to be very healthy, although there were a few dead chicks and some empty nests. We all took the opportunity to observe the behaviour of the albatross at close quarters. There was remarkably little aggression between birds, especially considering how close they lived together. The birds pair for life, and many displayed bonding behaviour that seemed to show true affection for each other. We sat for hours, just watching these immaculate gentle giants of the air.
When the evening falls and the daylight is fading, from within me calls, could it be I am sleeping? For a moment I stray, then it holds me close to home. I cannot say, close to home, feeling so far away.
In '96, we spent an uncomfortable night with gale force winds and noisy penguins. The second day on the island in '93 began with another magnificent sunrise. This peaceful tranquility contrasted remarkably with our second day on the island in '96. perched right on the edge of the cliffs and with strong easterly winds, we were in for a magic spectacle of complete mastery of the air. We were so close to them, they almost seemed tame. They were certainly inquisitive. Laurie and I sat for hours, enthralled by the freedom with which the birds effortlessly use the air currents. We stayed for so long that even the albatross seemed bored with our presence. Albatross behind the cliff had to scramble somewhat ungainly to the edge for lift-off. But once there, birds whose nests were below us used the wind to help descend the cliff face. A computerised weather station had been installed since our visit in '93. The station was sending data to the Tasmanian coast via a link at Cape Grim. Although the weather and sea conditions were moderating, there was still too much swell rolling into the gulch for us to launch comfortably. Anyway, we were not in any hurry to leave, with enough supplies for at least a week. Not like the party of Victorian naturalists who were stranded on the island for 10 days in 1894. They had only brought supplies for a maximum of 6 days. They watched anxiously each day for their hired boat to fetch them. There was so little wind on this occasion that their boat was swept down the coast by the strong tides. Instead, we climbed back to the cliff top to watch the albatross preening themselves and drifting overhead in the rays of the setting sun. In '93, we spent only one night on the island, and launching next day was a breeze in the still, calm conditions. In fact, it was so good, we decided to circumnavigate the island. We threaded our way through the rocks on the northern end of the island. Although a little choppy on the southwest corner, we had no problems at all. The eastern side was sheltered, and we hugged the shore, trying to sneak up on some fur seals, which we had seen when landing, but they were very timid and soon swam off. Then we headed off to Three Hummock Island, about 22 kilometres away.
Yeah, that's pretty close.
In '96, things weren't so easy. We watched the gulch, trying to pick the pattern of swells that was still rolling in. As the tide receded, conditions improved, and we decided to give it a go. Because my boat was the heaviest, with all the video gear, Laurie helped me launch. Due to the weight of the boat, we slipped going down the edge of the rocks, but after hurried entry, I was safe in deep water. Laurie watched for the 3 big swells, but was caught by a wave. He quickly pushed his boat out and paddled it out like a surfboard before hauling himself into the cockpit. My rudder had been damaged when we slipped down the rocks, so once we were away from the gulch, Laurie did a temporary repair with a piece of cord from his pocket. The Albatross were out to farewell us as we headed off for Three Hummock Island. A flock of muttonbirds took off from the water in front of us. We had a quick discussion and changed course to visit Dangerous Banks, an area we would normally stay well clear of. The tide and wind conditions today would prevent us from being drawn into this formidable area with its haystacks exploding upwards as high as houses. As it was, we were carried well clear of the breaking waves.
I've got a decent day ashore.
Yeah, let's hope so.
In pleasant conditions, we rounded Cape Caraudran, with a strong current pushing us into Hope Channel. The sea was now really flat calm.
Absolutely zipping along there. I can barely keep the camera on you.
In '93, we'd had similar light conditions. The strong tidal currents easily visible as boils on the surface. A moderate southeasterly ensured a fairly rapid crossing of Hope Channel. We were heading for Five Sisters Beach on the western end of the island. In '96, the weather was notably calmer, but we could still sail in the gentle breezes. As we landed in '93, the Allistons had just returned by plane. Mick and I strolled up to the homestead for a chat before heading up to a nearby hilltop. Later, Mick went trolling in his kayak, while I explored the rock formations on Burgess Point. We decided to cook down on the beach, to save taking gear up to our tents behind the dunes. Mick was sorting out which bits of broccoli were still edible after 3 days at sea. One for the pot, one for the beach. We settled down around a good campfire in pleasant conditions.
That was a big Yep.
Shortly after dark, we were visited by some fairy penguins on their way back to their burrows up in the dunes. They made a braying noise all night, not unlike a donkey. The following day was fine and clear. Today we were to head over to Hunter Island, but not before a refreshing swim. Mick embarrassingly forgot to put on his rear hatch cover before leaving. It was quite a feat in a North Sea tourer to remedy this without capsizing. We passed the Allison's jetty at Chimney Corner before heading across to Shepherd's Bay on Hunter Island. In '96, the day dawned overcast and cool. From a vantage point on the dunes, I looked over to Coulomb Bay and Ranger Point. We were going round the northern side of the island to East Telegraph Bay, from where we would probably climb South Hummock. This side of the island is rocky, with a few small sandy coves. Near Shark Bay, we came across the yacht Sooty Petrel from Launceston. They were going to do some recreational crayfishing. We asked for the latest weather forecast. Light southeasterlies for the next few days. Pushing on, we rounded Cape Rochon with surprisingly little current. We were now heading south, down the eastern side of the island, towards East Telegraph Bay. warm, isn't it? The clouds had cleared and we paddled in warm conditions with just enough breeze to sail. Landing on East Telegraph Beach can be difficult in strong easterly weather, but today it was no problem. We set up camp on the edge of a dry creek bed down on the beach. You couldn't find a more idyllic place anywhere.
Went a couple of nude women, a young bikini-clad girls or something.
I had suggested to Laurie that we climb South Hummock in time to get some sunset photographs from the telecom tower on the top. This would mean walking back for at least an hour in the dark, but there was a good track for at least half the way. Oh, it's quite reasonable.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Yep.
Telephone work?
Hello? Operator? I've gone dead.
The trip to the tower was certainly worthwhile, with a panoramic view over the whole area. We looked west to Hunter Island.
Hot shower on television, one day cricket on the telly.
To the south, you could just make out Walker Island on the horizon. While waiting for the sunset, we were intrigued by some butterflies that, believe it or not, were chasing swallows. At about 8:45, we climbed the tower again for the sunset.
Yep.
I don't know exactly when to take it.
As the sun went down, we could clearly see Steep Island where we had been 4 days ago. Walking back wasn't a problem to begin with,
Right.
but we lost the track near the beach and half fell down the dunes in the dark conditions.
Yeah, well, that's a new battery.
Right, that'll do. Day 6 on East Telegraph Beach. The easterlies had freshened overnight, blowing into Laurie's bivvy, but that didn't keep him awake. The waves had picked up a little, but not enough to bother us. Today was a relatively short hop around to the Allistons at Chimney Corner before crossing over to Shepherd's Bay. As usual, we stayed close inshore so that we could scrutinise the coast for likely campsites for future trips. We could soon see South Hummock, which we had come down from last night. Near Neal's Rocks, we landed to check out one of the few permanent sources of fresh water on these islands. As we approached Sandy Spit, the water shallowed, but we sailed on with a comfortable breeze behind us. At Chimney Corner, we came across another yacht. I had arranged to fill my water containers at the Allistons the day before, so we landed and had a brief chat to the Alliston sons. Then we headed out across Hope Channel to Shepherd's Bay. Much of Hunter Island had been burnt to create fresh grazing for cattle, but fortunately Little Shepherd's Bay remained unscathed. Crossing Hope Channel can be quite rough with strong tides, but today it had been easy in ideal conditions. The water was so incredibly blue and clear, a quick dip was in order before climbing the nearby crags to get a bird's eye view of the area. Laurie had climbed the opposite crag and we sat back and enjoyed the vista below. Three Hummock lay off to the east. A pair of patrolling Pacific gulls caught our attention as they circled anxiously over the bay. Back on the beach revealed why. They had a chick which had strayed from its nest.
I went round the dive, they suddenly started swooping over me and I saw this fluffy little thing on the rocks and I went down and jumped in the water and they're still bloody diving around and I didn't see it after that. These two were certainly swooping on me.
Our campsite was tucked away in trees behind the beach. It was so protected that you wouldn't have been disturbed even in a gale. We settled down to another pleasant evening around the fire. Next morning we could hardly believe our luck, with 7 straight days of fine weather. You couldn't wish for better conditions than this. Mind you, as soon as we got back, we had 2 weeks of constant gales. We paddled south along the shores of Hunter Island down towards Cave Bay. On the 93 trip, Mick and I climbed the cliffs and visited the cave. It was a bit of a scramble along the ledge leading to the cave. The cave had been investigated by Dr. Bodler in 1973. The artefacts found date the occupation of the cave by Tasmanian Aborigines to around 30,000 years ago. The early morning sun illuminated the cave interior. We didn't see any signs of habitation, but Mick found a mummified possum at the cave entrance. Later we walked up to visit Rick Lawrence at the homestead and stayed till late before returning to our tents on the beach. This was the last day of the 93 trip, and I took my usual dawn stroll along the beach. At the slipway, we donned our gear and set sail for Denham Hill via Stack Island. For an hour or so, we stopped at Stack Island, waiting for the tide to rise. I climbed a rocky crag for a better view over the islands. To the south once again lay the Doughboys and Trefoil. To the north was Three Hummock. I had plenty of time to explore the island while waiting for the tide. We had a following breeze and soon were in the shallow water near the channel to Robbins Island. We were startled by a number of large rays that we disturbed in the shallows.
Yep.
It is quite difficult to find the right channel out here, as everything is so flat and featureless. We tried to avoid getting out of our kayaks, but eventually had to resort to dragging them across 400 metres of sand to get into the right channel. Even then we had to wait for the incoming tide. In '96 we didn't land at Cave Bay as Rick Lawrence was away. Instead we went out to Penguin Islet on our way to Walker Island. It was occupied by quite a collection of birds, including pelicans. Laurie had calculated that to get into Walker Channel we had to paddle on our present bearing for another 55 minutes. This would mean avoid stranding on Middle Bank. As it was, we stopped on the bank so that I could change the batteries in the video camera. Walker Channel is deep, with a good current that was now taking us around the northern end of Walker Island. We stopped for lunch on rounding the point and then turned south down the eastern side of the island, passing the spectacular Cathedral Rocks. Mosquito Inlet was our last destination for the day. Laurie played around in the breakers on the way down the coast. It wasn't long before we turned and ran into the inlet on a flooding tide. We were amazed to see a tractor driving on the beach as we neared our campsite. They were out on the sand, setting a net before the tide came in. We left our kayaks to drift in with the tide while we set up camp in a shelter shed nearby. After tea, I went for a stroll along the beach. We needed a 5 o'clock start on the last day to catch the tide into Robin's Passage. It was a peaceful way to finish our trip, cruising along with a slight breeze, savouring the memories of the past 8 days.